This is Start, Launch, Grow, brought to you by Million Labs.
Here's what we cover in today's episode. In our catch-up section, we talk about whether AI-assisted apps are secure and scalable. Then I will sit down with Katie Rains, founder and CEO at Indigo, to discuss her Start, Launch, Grow journey. And finally, we wrap up with one clear takeaway. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Today we are going to do something slightly different. We are going to play a little role game. Whether it's low-code or vibe coding, we keep hearing the same concerns. How secure are AI-assisted apps? Are they GDPR compliant? And can I actually scale with them? So we thought it's time to record an episode about them. I will play the business leader, non-technical person, asking tons of questions to Simon, and Simon will share what we typically explain behind the scene. All right. So if AI helped build my app, how do I know it's secure? Isn't AI-generated code more risky?
All AI is doing is developing that code. It's just generating the code. It doesn't run any of your infrastructure. So it's not running the database. It's not running the hosted platform, the server that it sits on, or any of the firewall or the caches or anything else that sits around that bit of code that it becomes, your app or your web app. Those things haven't changed. They're still fundamentally the same. Your code, sure, there could be risks inside that. AI could have done something silly, but there are lots of tools now for checking the code. So actually, we obviously run a whole bunch of security checkers against the code using AI checkers to check that it's done it properly. So I think those problems are probably less than in the human world because, humans make mistakes as well.
But how can I understand it as a non-technical person? How can I control my code, basically?
That's an interesting question. Control your code. I mean, as a non-technical person, you never could anyway. So, you're always relying on a developer or, somebody else, whether it's your CTO or an outside freelancer or an agency, that the code was secure. Of course, you can use third parties to check your code. So you can still do that. You could do that before and you can still do that today with AI. So it doesn't have to be another AI tool checking it. You could have a penetration test or a software test done against it to check that it's secure.
Obviously, with all of the tools, the Lovables and Replets of the world, I can get to 50, 60% myself. And those tools promise to have a production-ready app. But how can I be sure that this is actually the case? Do I necessarily have to work with a third party? What is your thought on that?
I mean, I think as a non-technical founder, it's quite difficult to do that. I mean, obviously, you could ask for the code from whoever developed it, whether that be Lovable, etc. You could take that code and then you could find another piece of software to run against it. And you could probably figure that out as a non-technical founder. And that would give you some comfort. But, that's why you go to organizations like us, is to get some of that comfort back that it's being checked, and it's being constantly checked, because every change you make to a piece of code potentially opens up a new security vulnerability. So it's not a one-off. Was my code secure on Wednesday when we launched it? It's no, we've made changes. Is it secure now? We've made more changes. Is it secure now? So it's an ongoing process.
But how are local tools dealing with that then? Like when we look at Bubble, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Bubble is a whole environment. So they have a security wrapper around that, as does Replit, has a certain security wrapper around it. So they do a bunch of stuff for you to give you some level of protection. But of course, you can create, in no code as you can in code, you can create bad code that is insecure. Now, Bubble has a security checker. Replit has a security checker. And as I said, there's lots of other security checkers out there. So that's how most people are kind of dealing with it, is having, a third party bit of software come and look at your code.
So the real risk isn't really building with AI, but the real risk is building without understanding the structure underneath it.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about GDPR? How do I make sure we are compliant?
GDPR is not about a particular tool or piece of code or et cetera like that. Obviously, it's a compliance document with a set of guidance rules in there. It's things like, where's the data hosted? Is it in Europe? Or is it in the UK? Or is it in the US? But a lot of those things can be dealt with by policy and process and terms and conditions. Not to say, we're not lawyers here, but it's not to say that you're not GDPR compliant because your data is in the US. As long as you've declared that and you have all the data controls and all the rest of it in place, it could still be GDPR compliant. Now, it's obviously easier if it is in the UK, and certain industries require it to be in a certain location. So we can do that.
So when we look at Bubble and Replit, what are the options for that?
Yeah, so Bubble by default uses Amazon Web Services, but only in the US. So you don't have any choice. If you're on the standard plans with Bubble, it's in the US, that's it, tough. Now, we can do some things with Bubble where we have an external database and we push the data from Bubble into an external database. It's expensive to do that. It's challenging technically. It adds a lot more complexity to it. So in most cases, we just don't recommend that for a customer. With things like Replit and coded apps, yeah, we can spin up the database anyway. It's really quick and easy. If you want it in Germany or you want it in the UK, not a problem. We can do that.
How easily can I scale with a platform? So what happens when I hit 5,000, 10,000 users?
Every founder and every SME wants to answer the scale question. Like, we're going to have millions of customers. Like, will this product scale? And the reality is, of our 2,000 customers, I would say only 5% or less ever get to that scaling problem. So 95% never even becomes an issue. So I'm not saying don't think about it. I'm just saying it's probably less of a problem than you think it is. Certainly, Bubble will scale to, hundreds and hundreds of users, maybe thousands of users, maybe even 10,000s of users, depending on what you're doing with it. And then the coded environment, the Replits in coded environment, they're just going to scale. They're built on infrastructure that will auto scale. So that's not a problem at all.
So if I summarize this, we started with 3 concerns: security, GDPR, compliance, and scalability. And what I'm hearing is this: AI-assisted apps can absolutely be secure and scalable if they are built properly. So AI accelerates development, but it doesn't replace structure. So the system behind still needs to be built securely and designed with scale. So what that means for me is probably either I invest time to learn the tools properly and get the foundations right. Otherwise, someone else has to pick it up and we might have to redo stuff. Or I work with someone who already has the expertise and makes sure the foundation is right from day one.
Exactly. I mean, whether you're doing it AI code or no code, you're in code anyway, you're derived from it, but ultimately it ends up in code. And the real question is, how is your system, how is your app going to change over the course of time? And that's what will, break it, not necessarily the number of users, etc. It'd be the complexity of the app and other things that will cause you challenges before the kind of number of users, etc. And getting that structure up front correct is the key thing here. Getting that database designed correctly, getting the back end, the front end, all those sort of technical things done correctly will allow you to scale. Getting that wrong, you will hit the buffers a lot quicker. And that's what we see with vibe coding, particularly with, non-technical founders that manage to produce something. Great, you produce something, but really it's not going to survive probably more than a handful of customers. And, you've not thought about a lot of the security and that infrastructure stuff.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you so much. Then let's jump into today's interview with Katie. Today, I'm joined by Katie, a founding partner of Indigo, joining us from the UK. Katie co-founded Indigo more than 18 years ago and is a great example of how to drive innovation within a growing services business. Katie, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
To get started, could you briefly let us know what Indigo is all about and where the company stands today?
So Indigo, we describe ourselves as audience specialists, and we work in the arts, culture and heritage sectors, mostly in the UK and Ireland, but we occasionally do work in Europe as well. So we're all about helping cultural organisations bring the audience voice into their decision making. So it could be things like audience research or data analysis, but really just understanding how they bring audiences into those decisions. So as you say, we've been going for 18 years. Most of the work that we did for the first few years was basically consultancy work. But in the past few years since COVID, we've become much better known for our audience research work. So now we're pretty much a research and insight company. And we've grown the business from just being myself during COVID to now there being 9 of us.
And what are the types of customers you work with?
So we work with venue-based organisations, so arts centres, concert halls, theatres, but also producing organisations, so orchestras who tour, dance companies, ballet companies. We work with museums and galleries, visitor attractions, outdoor heritage spaces, all kinds of things.
So then let's go back to the early days. So how did Indigo come to life? How have you validated the business model in the early days?
Well, in the early days, it was, to be honest, it was pretty much a lifestyle business for me because I was working as a marketing director in various large theatres. And of course, if you work in theatre, you have to be there every evening, pretty much. You're there 3 or 4 evenings a week. And as a young woman who wanted to start a family, I realised that that wasn't going to be very compatible. So at some point, I needed to do something else. And I went and worked in a university for a while. I was director of marketing for Durham University in the UK. But my heart was always in the arts. So when my husband actually was offered a job in Birmingham, we were going to move to Birmingham. And I thought, what am I going to do? So I thought, right, I'll just put some feelers out, see if there's any freelance work around. Unfortunately, my first 2 clients were the Royal Shakespeare Company and Welsh National Opera, which are 2 of the biggest organisations in the UK. So working with them kind of gave me the confidence to sort of go, oh, okay, there are things that I can do. And I focused very much on CRM and customer relationship management and loyalty at the time, and built a name for myself doing that. So out of that, I started a consultancy business. And that was, as I say, very much about working one-to-one with individual organizations. And that fitted my life really well with 2 small children. I did a lot of traveling still because pre-COVID, who knew you could have just met on screens and stuff? So I was still on trains all the time, and things. But then I sort of built up lots of experience, lots of knowledge about what was going on across the sector. And so the business model really was it was a consultancy model. So very sort of labor intensive. Your time is your cost. There's no opportunity to scale it. I didn't particularly want to take on other staff at the time. So it was very much that kind of lifestyle business. And if you wanted to earn more, you simply had to put the hours in. You know, there was a direct relationship between time and money. And so I kind of didn't understand really at that point the need to try and scale and to grow the business in a way that would make it possible for it to operate without me or without me being involved in everything. So that kind of went on for 15 years, really, like that. And I didn't really question the business model until we got to COVID, because of course I had lots of work with cultural organisations, and then suddenly they closed their doors overnight and all the work just disappeared. You know, who needs a CRM strategy if you're closed? You don't need one. I didn't know how long that was going to last. So I thought, okay, what does the sector need right now? And of course, I worked out that actually the thing they needed most was to understand what audiences were thinking and feeling during that time. And we had all these different regulations coming in about social distancing and moving people into seats where they could have space around them, and wearing masks, and shorter performances and different performance times. And so I realized that if you were working in a cultural organization, you were going into all of this blind, just doing what the government said you had to do without understanding people were, as we remember, people were scared, really frightened. And the idea that you would be too frightened to go to a theatre performance or a concert just seemed inconceivable. So I kind of worked out that really what I needed to be doing, if I couldn't earn any money, what I needed to be doing was making myself useful. So, and because I had a network and so many contacts across the industry, I said, okay, I'll put together a survey to audiences. And I talked to some clients and friends about it to see what sort of things we needed to know. And I'll just put it out there and say, would you like to use it? And so the benefit of doing that was I had 600 organizations sign up for that first survey to take part in it. And they sent me their details and I set them up on the survey. But of course, what that meant was every organization sent out the same questions to their audiences. And I aggregated the findings, and I had this data set of about 250,000 audience responses, like really quickly within a week or so of the shutdown. So I was able to had to learn how to do a webinar, had to learn how to present results, and then play them back to the sector to say, okay, actually, we thought audiences were going to be worried about this. They're not so worried about this, but they are worried about this. So we were able to sort of give the information that people needed. And when I started off doing it, I thought, great, I've done my bit now. I've done this survey. We'll see what's next. But then they were like, right, when are you doing the next one? I was, okay, I have to do it again. So I was churning out these kind of surveys, changing the questions all the time, depending on what the regulations were and what organizations wanted to know, about every month. And so I built up this huge data set and huge network, basically, of organizations who wanted me to do that work for them. So that's how it kind of started. And I started realizing that actually we were an audience insight business. You know, we weren't really a consultancy. And that opportunity to do something, to be at the center of something that could be coordinated across the whole sector and all share in a bit like crowdfunding, you know, share the learnings together, was really empowering for everybody. And so that's basically what we started to do.
So at some point you need to kind of streamline and bring it together. So it would be great if you walk us a little bit through at what point was the chaos too much? Like at what point did you want to change something and how did that look like?
So basically on the back of that, we launched a set of services. So now we've grown to about 3 or 4 people because weirdly, people started paying me for this stuff finally, which was great. We built the company up to about 3 or 4 of us at this point, and we'd realised that actually this wasn't just a one-off thing that was needed in COVID. There was actually a product here that organisations saw the benefit of doing research in a way that they could benchmark against each other and with each other and share the findings across. So we launched something that we called Indigo Share. My company's called Indigo. So we launched Indigo Share, which was all about the collaborative approach to doing audience research. And we launched a number of products on that. But we very quickly came unstuck because even with 20 or 30 organisations on it, there was a lot of manual work that needed to be done to set them up, to record things on spreadsheets. We had survey software, we had spreadsheets, we had finance software, we had all these different things. And every organisation had slightly different needs. And we were trying to it was like herding cats, trying to get them all sort of down at something that could be scaled. We realised that if we suddenly got double the amount of customers that we had, we would be back to the old model of just needing more people. So we're like, that's not going to work. We need something that actually can properly scale. And that's when we recognised that we needed to do something to try and put in place something that was bespoke for the way that we were doing things, and that would mean we could be more responsive to our customers.
I think with these things, it's always important to ask, right? Like, what are the needed functionalities versus the nice to haves? Could you just also walk us a little bit through your thinking of how does V1 version look like? Like, how did you assess what's really critical for that?
Well, it's important to say we're not tech developers and we've never developed a product before because we just do consulting. So for us, this was a completely new way of thinking. And the first thing we did was we got a big Miro board up and like put everything we wanted this thing to do on this Miro board. And it was fairly frightening. There was so much on there. And so we then started going, okay, so if we whittled this right down to what the core features are that it must have as a sort of minimum viable product, what would that look like? And when we started kind of trying to write the brief for what we actually wanted you guys to build, it was a balance between not losing any of that vision and creative thinking, recording it somewhere, but saying and making sure it was on the board, but then going, okay, what's this bit here? And even then, I think we probably asked for too much in the first instance, but we kept whittling away until we got to that core.
So when you launched the application, when you rolled it out to your customers, was there anything that surprised you when they started using it?
I think what surprised us was the reaction that we had from customers, that before we'd been sort of sending them different links to different places to find things. And what this front end that you built for us enabled us to do was for them to just see everything in one place and just with one click be able to get to what they wanted to from pretty much a single interface page. And they responded well to that. And also because it was all then branded with Indigo, it just made, even though behind it, a lot of the tech was exactly the same, what we put in front made it much more professional and just easier for customers to use. So I think it surprised us what the difference in perception was from them to what the product was. We were suddenly able to start describing the product much more easily to them because they could see this interface with everything on it.
What would you say is the impact of the application for Indigo today?
I think there's internal and external impacts for us. I think internally, we're starting to build a much better understanding of what working in beta is all about across all our work, which we'd never really done before. We're all perfectionists and completer finishers, and we like to, we were doing a project and writing a report and finishing it off and handing it in and then moving on. And I think what this process has done is it's helped us to develop a way of working in the organisation that can say, okay, it's not going to be perfect first time, but it needs to be good enough first time. And then we whittle away the bits that don't work, and then we expand again and we go again, and this sort of iteration. And we can bring that into all of our work, into our consulting work, into our research, everything. So it's a completely different way of thinking and working internally. And I think what it's done externally, as I say, it's helped us to reinforce the brand of IndigoShare and actually have a front end for it, and to think about customers starting to see that as a product that they can trust. And as we build more tech, as we start to iterate on top of that, hopefully they will see that as a single entity and something that they can trust.
When would you say is a good point to bring on additional people?
It was made quite easy for me at the start, because in COVID, because I'd reached out to the sector and offered to do these things, there were a lot of people who'd been furloughed from their jobs who offered to come and help me for nothing. So one of my staff, who's now with me as a permanent employee, had actually volunteered to help me with some of this stuff when I wasn't getting paid for any of it. And so in a way, for the first time, I had to let go of something and let somebody else be part of it. But it was fairly low risk in that sense. And then I was lucky enough to get there was lots of funding around at the time to support small businesses like myself. And so I was very glad to have some government funding that helped me then work with a mentor and a growth specialist who helped me figure out some of the numbers, get on top of my numbers. I hadn't had any accounting software before. Suddenly I got myself accounting software, I got systems, I got to start understanding my finances and my numbers, and working with really experienced growth coaches who were used to taking founders through to scaling businesses. They were able to help me figure out some of the numbers around that. And the best piece of advice that they gave me was, you need to hire before you need somebody, not once the work is already there, because it's too late then.
Last question for you, Katie. What are some lessons learned from that journey? Like, what was harder than what you expected? What was actually easier? What is the recommendation you would give to others out there?
The simplest thing that will actually do the job. That was the hardest thing. And I think often people don't appreciate simplicity. And certainly in our work, what I always try and do with our client work is to help our arts organisations see it really simply, what the answer is. And that takes more time. And I think there's a quote from Winston Churchill when he said, "I'm sorry, this memo is so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter." And it's that sort of principle that just spending that time to get that clarity and focus. So that has been hard in every area of the business, on the product, on the direction of the business, just not trying to do too much all at once. And I think what was easier than expected in a way is the tech. The tech is often the bit that seems the scariest, but actually if you've got that clarity and focus, building it is actually not that difficult. It's the complicating things and not being clear about what you want and what you want first and what you don't want. That's the hard bit.
Most people fail because they build the wrong thing. And that's the validation that people tend to skip. And that can even be within an existing business, right? You always have to validate before you drive new innovation. Thank you so much for all your insights, Katie. It was wonderful to have you here, and we wish you and the whole Indigo team all the best.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Verena. How was your interview with Katie?
Yeah, it was a very interesting chat. I think one of the biggest learnings from the chat is how powerful a crisis can be if you're really willing to listen to your customers. So when COVID hit, Katie didn't try to protect her existing business. She didn't ask, how do I keep selling what I was selling before? But she asked a much better question. What do my customers actually need right now? And how can I adjust to that? And that can feel very scary at the beginning because it changes a lot, right? But it actually unlocked a way more scalable business in the long term.
If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more conversations like this, Make sure you subscribe to our podcast at all the major podcast providers. Our goal is to encourage more people to take action and turn their ideas into execution, into a startup, into a project. We also run our Start, Launch, Grow newsletter, where we share practical advice for every stage of your journey. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next episode.